We're going to see one insight that Rashi has into how it is that Moshe Rabbeinu gathered the Jewish people right at the end of his life that tells us a unique insight, firstly into the role of Moshe and to the role of Yehoshua and the connection that Moshe has with the Jewish people. Same Parasha saying at the end of our Parasha Vayeilech the Torah tells us, as Moshe Rabbeinu had ongesagt the Levim no Sarah and Bris Hashem, that Moshe instructed the Levim, who are the ones carrying the Aron, take the Sefer Torah, and then he says, Hakilu Elai, gather to me as kol ziknei shiftechem shatechem v'adabra b'ozneim gomer, all of the elders of your tribes and the policemen, etc., and I'm going to speak to them. Rashi picks up on that. Rashi Hakilu Elai. So Rashi quotes those two words, gather them to me. On his Mefarish, he explains two things. Number one, they did not blow trumpets in order to gather the people, which is the normal means of gathering the people. Why not? Because the Torah tells us clearly the chatzotzos had to be made for you, for Moshe, and therefore Yehoshua had no authority over them. Point one. Point two, even in Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime, nignazu, those chatzotzos were buried or hidden before Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, the day that he passed away, to fulfill the meaning of the pasuk that says, a person has no control on the day that they are to pass away. So what do you think is Rashi's question? It would appear simply that the question Rashi is looking to address in this parasha is Virash Alein Zogt, which you can imply from Rashi's words, that they did not blow the trumpets in order to gather the people that day. So what's the question that Rashi is addressing? It would appear that Rashi wants to address the obvious question, why are they not blowing trumpets in order to bring the people together? Because we already know from Pashas Ba'aloischa that that's how you assemble the community. One of the key purposes of these trumpets is in order to assemble the nation. Und der Hechech zu sagen, als Akilo meint nicht makel sein Gemisch mit Hayedur v'hainu b'chatzeitzos. So how is Rashi so sure that when it says Hakilo Elai, gather the people to me, that it does not mean to use the trumpets? It's from dem was der Tziva shel Moshe. Hakilo is given to the Leviim. That would appear to be because Moshe is instructing the Leviim, and they are not the ones who blow the trumpets. Und die Tekiah b'chatzeitzos hat gemol sein dafka durch die Kohanim b'nei Aaron HaKohanim, because who is supposed to normally blow the trumpets? Kohanim. So if Moshe is instructing the Levim to gather the people, that immediately implies it's not through trumpets, and so therefore the question is why, and it would appear that that's what Rashi is explaining. So nicht verstandig was Rashi sagt, but what is strange is how Rashi explains why they're not using chatzaitzos. Because the pasuk said, make the trumpets you, Moshe, for yourself, and therefore Yehoshua had no authority over them. How does Yehoshua get into this conversation? It's not mentioned in the Torah. We would never have expected that Yehoshua was going to blow the chatzaitzos. Why is this even an issue? So Rashi kommt doch from Favosot, Moshe nicht makel gewend dem kol alle chatzaitzos. It would appear that Rashi's question is, why is Moshe gathering the people without using chatzaitzos? So Rashi should have just said very simply, they didn't blow chatzaitzos, why not? Call to gather the people, to fulfill the meaning of the pasuk that you do not have authority on the day that a person passes away, and Moshe, this is the day of his passing, no longer has that authority. Not only that, but Nachmer, the marker from the Pirush Rashi is in Tanchuma Medrash Rabbah. It would appear that Rashi's source is the Medrash Tanchuma and the Medrash Rabbah. If in pasuk Haseilecha on the psukim, on the pasuk that say Haseilecha that Moshe had to make the chatzaitzos for himself. But dort there the Midrashim do not speak about the fact that Yehoshua did not have the authority to use the chatzaitzos in the context of our discussion, in the context of this assembly. Rather, they speak more generally, that Yehoshua generally never got to use those chatzaitzos because it's a seilecha, it's for Moshe. Where the Torah is telling us that you, Moshe, will use the chatzaitzos and nobody else. No, and the example that the Medrash gives that Yehoshua does not use the chatzaitzos is specifically the war to bring down the walls of Yericho. Doesn't mention our scenario. And then after that, and independently of that, Then the Medrash says, not only is it that Yehoshua did not get to use the Chatzotos, but even Moshe himself, on the day that he was going to pass away, was also restricted from using them. Hakilu Elai. Now the Medrash brings our story about assembling the nation. Where were the Chatzotos and why didn't Moshe use them? Because they've been hidden away. Why were they hidden away? To fulfill the pasuk that tells us that on a day that a person passes away, they have no authority. Says Tamor, it's really strange then. Rashi. How come Rashi, who always explains things according to the simplest understanding, should bring all of the detail from the Medrash about Yehoshua not having access to the Chatzotos, and in the context of Moshe gathering the Jewish people, something even the Medrash didn't do. How does Yehoshua get into this picture? Some of the Mefarshim, like the Maskil David, try and explain if theoretically Yehoshua would have had the authority to use the Chatzotos after Moshe had passed away, then they would have been able to be used on that day. Even though Moshe himself was going to pass away on that day, they wouldn't cancel the Chatzotos because the next heir to the Chatzotos would at least have the rights to use them. Therefore, Rashi has to tell us Yehoshua never gets the authority over the Chatzotos, and therefore even on this day that Moshe is going to pass away, nobody could use the Chatzotos. And even if that is correct, Rashi, that doesn't address the language that Rashi used. But Rashi had gedacht, logic would have dictated that first Rashi should tackle the question of why Moshe himself is not using the Chatzotos, because it's the day of his passing where he no longer has that authority. And then, if it's relevant, add further information. Okay, so Moshe cannot use the Chatzotos because it's the day of his passing. What about Yehoshua? To which he could have answered, well, that's because Yehoshua was never given that authority. But it doesn't seem logical to start off first telling us that Yehoshua has no access or rights to the Chatzotos, and then tell us, and even Moshe didn't have rights to the Chatzotos. So something is very odd. How did Yehoshua get into the equation? Why does Rashi prioritize Yehoshua over Moshe in explaining the lack of Chatzotos at this assembly? Before we can answer this, we're going to look at two things just in the language of Rashi as well. There are a number of diukim, of nuances in Rashi's text, and we're going to look at two of them. Number one, why is he using the expression shlita, which is like control? That Yehoshua had no control or authority over the Chatzotos. Why didn't Rashi just say something much more simple, which actually is the language that the Medrash uses, that Yehoshua never got to use the Chatzotos? Something along those lines. Especially when you consider that there are many Gersos that much earlier in Baal Oischa, when we originally learnt about the Chatzotos, and when Moshe was told, Aseh lecha, make them for you, that there Rashi says, Ata oise, you make them, or mishtamish bohem, and you may use them, v'lo yacher, and nobody else. So why not use that expression, mishtamish, instead of the word hishlit? Also, Beis, if Rashi's question is, why did they not use the Chatzotos in order to gather the people, then the word he should have used as his headline should have been the word hakilu, gather the people. Why did he include the word Eli to me? Rashi is doch no first dem wort hakilu. Surely Rashi is only explaining the context of the word hakilu, gather the people, as to ifan hakol is nikiven al yedei Chatzotos, and clarifying that the way to gather the people was without Chatzotos. Who needs the word Eli? So, in order to answer this, we're going to learn a lesser-known principle about how Rashi works, which is that if Rashi spells out a question, it's actually not the primary question that he's looking to answer. In order to explain this, let's first explore this principle about the klal of how Rashi teaches. Generally speaking, Rashi's approach to both his commentary on Torah and on Gemara is not to spell out the question that he looks to address. So Rashi goes straight into his commentary, and once we learn his commentary, naturally we can identify what the question was and why it is no longer a question. Nochmer, but then it goes a step beyond that. In Phil, frequently when Rashi does begin his commentary by identifying the question that he seeks to address, he says, that's not because that is the primary question driving his commentary. Nor, as from them it's because Rashi is drawing our attention to a particular question, so that when we answer that question, it will help us address the primary question that Rashi wants to address. Velcha Rashi is nit mefaret, even though that primary question Rashi does not specify. But that's exactly what's happening here. The fact that Rashi alerts us to the fact that, oh wow, they're gathering the people without chatzotzos is das niti shaila ikris in pasuk. That is not the big question Rashi needs to address. The Adarabba, to the contrary, Kama Pashtoni, many of the commentators, the Even Ezra, the Chizkuni, the Ramban, then as mitvayitzav Moshe Halavim Gomer Lokecha Sefer HaTorah Azeh Gomer, when the pasuk tells us that Moshe instructed the Levim to take the Sefer Torah and gather the people, V'gemeinte Kohanim, actually, even though it uses the word Levim, it refers to the Kohanim as we see multiple times throughout Tanakh. V'shtei Frir Vayitno di Sefer Torah La Kohanim B'nei Levi Gomer. In fact, even in our parasha where it says that he gave the Sefer Torah to the Kohanim, who are descendants of Bnei Levi, or if he's a Kemedach Len Al Kol Ponim Al Derech HaPshat, which would mean that if I'm looking at simple understanding of this pasuk, I could have said, as I could have assumed, because he's addressing the Kohanim, I could have just assumed that the gathering is through the Kohanim, and then there's no question about, how this gathering is happening. Now, Rashi is in debate about rather, what's bothering Rashi most is the composite of those two words, Hakilu, gather the people, a lie to me. That's the key thing that's bothering Rashi. To address the question Rashi has on that expression, Hakilu, a lie, gather them to me, to be able to answer that, is given in he first has to draw our attention to the fact that, unlike what some of the other Meforshim want to indicate, this is an unusual gathering that does not include the Kohanim, and therefore, by extension, does not include the Chatzotzos. And when we unearth why it is that they did not assemble the people using trumpets as they normally would, that will address the bigger question of why it says Hakilu Elai. So what is the big question about Hakilu Elai? Is the big issue that Rashi wants to clarify for us with this expression Hakilu Elai, gather them to me, is as follows. Rashi already told us right at the beginning of this parasha that when the pasuk tells us that Moshe says, I can no longer enter or leave, that doesn't mean that he was weak, chas v'shalom, but rather it means eini reshai. It means I no longer have the authority to lead. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was telling the Jewish people, the authority has been taken from me and has now been given to Yeshua. And a little later, Rashi then explains or expands on this concept with a broader axiom, which is dabar echad ledor v'lo shnei dabarim ledor, that you can only have one spokesperson, one leader for the generation at a time. Therefore, when Yeshua is the leader, Moshe no longer has that authority. As Yeshua is showing Gevarim to Dabar Echad Ledor, why that is relevant to our conversation is because at this point, when this assembly is supposed to happen, Yehoshua is already the official authority in charge of the Jewish people. In that case, is Muksha, that raises a question. Vikumtes, as the Akolofonin is given durch Moshe. If Yehoshua is the leader, why is Moshe the one gathering the people? He should have passed the baton to Yehoshua. You gather the people. And yes, it's because Moshe wants to speak to the Jewish people. And yes, of course, it's Moshe who wanted to address the Jewish people. And bring heaven and earth as witnesses to what he was about to say, which effectively is Parshas Ha'azinu. But the physical assembly of the people, that is the authority and the responsibility of the leader. Or Vabald, as Yeshua Geworden the Dabar Echad Lador, seeing as Rashi has already illustrated from the pasuk that Yehoshua is now the supreme authority of the Jewish community. It should have been that Yehoshua gathers the people, and once they have gathered, then Moshe could address them. Or at the very least, the assembly of the community should have been a shared responsibility of Moshe and Yehoshua. in the same way as the address that is about to happen to the Jewish people was a shared address between Moshe and Yeshua. Hu v'Hoshea ben Nun, as the pasuk tells us. But it should never have said, as the pasuk says, gather them to me, prioritizing Moshe. That Eli Moshe zokt akilu was a shel Yeshua. By saying that Moshe wants to gather the people to himself, that appears to negate Yehoshua, who is now actually the leader of the Jewish people. How could that be? That's a massive question that Rashi wants to address. In order to address that question, Rashi first gives us other information we might not have noticed, which is that day they did not employ the chatzotzos to gather the people. Why is that? Well, if Yehoshua is the leader, then the first piece of information I need to know is why Yehoshua could not have used the chatzotzos. Because the pasuk said, "You Moshe make them for yourself." And therefore Rashi doesn't just simply say that Yehoshua doesn't get to use them, but he's not given that authority when he is given authority over the Jewish people. Because not only knowing that Yehoshua doesn't have access to the chatzotzos, but more importantly, that he doesn't have authority over the chatzotzos, will not only explain why there are no trumpets, but will also explain why the gathering is directed by Moshe. Hakilo Eli, bring them to me. In the minyan von Vayeilech Yehoshua aleim is l'chayr nit verstandig. So let's explore this concept of when Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, make the chatzotzos for you. How does that clearly tell us that Yehoshua could never have authority over them? Let's understand it. The fact that the pasuk said, make the chatzotzos for you, as Rashi says, you make them, you use them, nobody else uses them. At face value, it would appear that means you, Moshe, because you are Moshe, can use these chatzotzos. Another person who's just an ordinary person may not. But now we're talking about Yehoshua, not an ordinary person. Who's Yehoshua? That's the leader that Moshe Rabbeinu requested who would lead the Jewish people, the Manig von Eden. This is a leader and shepherd of the Jewish people fulfilling Moshe's role. He's not just anybody. With the mantle of leadership, why don't we also transfer the rights to use the chatzotzos to Yehoshua? And he should be able to use them to assemble the people. Just like the authority of Moshe Rabbeinu is given to Yehoshua, in general, the authority over the chatzotzos should be given to Yehoshua. That illustrates to us that not every aspect of Moshe's authority was in fact transferred to Yehoshua. Because fundamentally Moshe's leadership was at a far superior level to Yehoshua's leadership. As Rashi already told us in Pashas Pinchas, Moshe Rabbeinu's face is like the sun, implying that it's a very intense and a source of energy, whereas Yehoshua is a less intense moon, a reflection of energy. That's why Rashi says specifically that Hashem did not give authority to Yehoshua over these chatzotzos. Yehoshua doesn't get any rights to the chatzotzos, because not everything of Moshe's leadership and authority was in fact transferred to Yehoshua. Which helps us to understand, as calls man Moshe Rabbeinu gelebt, as long as Moshe Rabbeinu is alive, even after the official authority had been passed from him to Yehoshua. If Moshe Rabbeinu is a leader at a far greater level than Yehoshua, it will make it inappropriate for Yehoshua to gather the people if Moshe Rabbeinu is still there. Because certain parts of the leadership authority were not transferred to Yehoshua, there are certain things that Moshe was the one and only to ever have authority and power over these things. Now that we know this, and it's all illustrated in the fact that Yehoshua does not get to use the chatzotzos in order to gather the people, now that Rashi is addressing the primary issue, why is it Moshe calling for the people to be gathered to him even though he is not the practical leader of the Jewish people anymore. So Rashi wanted to know, why is the gathering happening through Moshe Rabbeinu? Is Rashi mefarish them prat? Then Rashi can get into the detail. Yehoshua clearly cannot gather the people. That we've clarified, because he doesn't have the same level of leadership as Moshe. So then we deal with the details. How did Moshe gather the people? That raises a question. Why doesn't Moshe use the chatzotzos as he normally would have? Therefore, Rashi brings as a second point, even while Moshe Rabbeinu was still alive, the chatzotzos were already hidden prior to the day of his passing, to clarify that this is aligned with the pasuk that says a person does not have authority on the day that they pass away. So we now understand why Rashi not only said what he said, but also how he said it, including the wording that he chose and the order in which he presented this wording. And then there is a deeper spiritual message within this too. There's something that does not appear to make sense. We've already clarified that the means of assembling the nation over here could not be using trumpets. Because as we've indicated, having those trumpets implies a certain measure of authority that at this point is lacking. According to Pshat, Rashi's understanding, where the pasuk says clearly that the Levim are the ones who are supposed to now gather the people. Why the Levim and not the Kohanim? Usually the Kohanim are blowing the chatzotzos, so they're the ones gathering the people. Why here is it moved to the Levim? To understand that, we need a deeper explanation, according to Chassidus, of what it really means that a person does not have authority on the day that they pass away. Because it sounds like that is a downgrade, and surely that is inappropriate for a tzaddik. Why would it be that on the day that he's passing away, Moshe Rabbeinu should be so-called demoted? By tzaddikim is doch adrab. The reality of a tzaddik is to the contrary. They're constantly progressing. As a very nisalim yom liyom, they're elevated on a daily basis. And especially on their very last day on earth. Is doch sicher, as Moshe Rabbeinu is given betachlis so ilu. Any tzaddik, and certainly Moshe Rabbeinu, must be at the peak of their spiritual development. So why then would we say take something away? They don't have authority on the day of the passing. Specifically in Moshe Rabbeinu's case, the Gemara Rosh Hashanah tells us that on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, he reached the 50th level of bina, of understanding, which is an incredible level of depth of appreciation of Hashem, which is be'ein haroich. It is infinitely beyond any human's experience. Out of the 50 gates of bina understanding that were shared with the world, is up until the day of his passing, Moshe Rabbeinu was not yet given access to that 50th totally radical level of insight and awareness of Hashem. So how then would you say that he has no control on the day of his passing? The explanation is far deeper than we imagine. Why would we suggest that a tzaddik has no control in this world on the day that they're passing? It is dafka because of their greatness, because they are so elevated at that apex of their lives. As Dan statement, they are so elevated that they are beyond having an association with and therefore control over this physical world. If you have control over something, that implies relationship. You are connected in some way or relating in some way to that which you control. Yes, it's true that a king is head and shoulders above the community, which implies that the shoulders, which are a representation of midos, are superior to the head. And how much more so then is the head of the king superior to the heads of the rest of the community? But still, to be the king has to be a relative position. The king has to be able to control the people, direct the people, inspire the people, guide the people, lead the people. So that means even though he is far superior to the people, he must still be within range. He has to somehow relate to the people. And that's how he can be the shoilet, the one who has control. But on the day of a tzaddik's passing, they are so elevated, they are even beyond being in a position of directing and controlling the people. So it's not possible that you could even be in control of or leading the people because you're so spiritually aloof from the people at that particular point in time. That is generally the case. So can remain, and in which case would think, as we bald Moshe Rabbeinu is Nisada geworden in Darga, wo is in ganzen Hecher von Shlita al Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu at the day of his passing is now so extremely elevated beyond the level of being the one leading or controlling the people. Is nicht doch ein Chas v'Shalom kein Sheiches v'Keshet zwischen Moshe und Yisrael. You could mistakenly believe that in those circumstances, Moshe and the Jewish people no longer actually have a connection or relationship. Sagt der Pasuk, as Philip and Moshe Rabbeinu steht in der Darga, therefore the Pasuk clarifies, even when Moshe is at such an incredibly advanced level. Moshe, on the day of his passing, Sagt Moshe Haki'ilu Elai, Moshe says, gather to me. There's a personal connection and relationship over here. To Moshe. Weil ihnen seinem Be'etzem ein Sach mit dem Etzem von Moshe Rabbeinu, because the relationship between Moshe and the Jewish people is not purely a relationship of leaders and followers of a king and his people. It is a fundamental intrinsic connection. Moshe who Yisrael and Moshe, as Rashi tells us in Pashas Chukas, that Moshe and the Yidden are one and the same entity. Which is the deeper reason why there are no trumpets to gather the people at this particular point. If you have to blow trumpets in order to get people together, that implies that there's a certain amount of investment of energy that is required in order to get the people together. It's not a natural process. Whereas the gathering of the people to come close to Moshe Rabbeinu on the day that he's about to pass away, the day when the essence of Moshe is most availably revealed, so then you see that the Jewish people have an intrinsic connection to Moshe. Not only is it there in concept, but it's there in practice. They are drawn to him almost like a magnet. Wie Chazal sagen, as bei jeden Eden is hier Milsa Sutra Sehi defar, was the Gabe Moshe Milsa Sutra Sehi. Like the Gemara famously tells us that the reason Yira is accessible to every single one of us is because it's absolutely easy and accessible for Moshe. And with Alter Rebbe is das Mevar, as Alter Rebbe explains, as jede Id hat in sich mit Mchinas Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashanim, that what that really means is that every one of us has an element of Moshe within ourselves. Despite the fact that we don't necessarily consciously feel that we have this Moshe chromosome or this Moshe element to us. But the reality is, Moshe is Yisrael. Yisrael is Moshe. Nevertheless, even if we're unconscious of our depth of relationship with Moshe, the fact that we have that intrinsic relationship makes it that much easier for us to have fear of heaven. It's normal and natural. And the same thing applies here. We can understand why it is that this gathering, which seems to be a gathering without all of the extraneous effort, because suddenly the inside of us has been switched on, and therefore we realize our connection to Moshe Rabbeinu, and we come magnetized towards him. And who facilitates that? Dafka the Levim, not the Kohanim. Because Kohanim, the whole energy of Kohanim is associated with the attribute of Chesed, which is the flow of higher energy to lower recipients. Or Nevi'im, whereas the energy of Nevi'im is the energy of Gevura, which is force, to push things from where they are in a lower reality upwards, as we're bringing the Jewish people from their reality towards Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, in order to assemble the Jewish people to Moshe, so Moshe be a state in Allah, be a Moshe, not just Moshe, but Moshe at the highest experience of Moshe, Hecher von Shilton, Moshe as he is beyond and aloof and abstracted from having that level of control over the people, is as durch the Levim. Who facilitates that? Levim, because that's their energy. They are the ones who are able to influence and inspire the Jewish people to be able to lift themselves in order to be able to connect to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's Hashem, we should lift ourselves to be able to connect to the ultimate Moshe Rabbeinu, Mashiach, and we should see Mashiach Begolei now.